So Rob, thank you for coming.
My pleasure. Thank you for being there and doing all the...
How's life in quarantine?
It's okay so far. I am in my house with my 3 sons who are 18, 20 and 23. So it's a fairly lively lockdown. My vegetable garden will be the best it has been for quite a long time.
Marvelous. Okay, so you're going to present a little 10 little stories, perhaps.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for doing this and for inviting me. And I wanted to just start out with something that's not necessarily very, very regular in transition gatherings, but I wanted to just read you a little section from a book about Capt Beefheart, who was a very famous 1960s artist who I absolutely adore. And in about 1968, his band went to the UK to tour for their very first time. And a few years ago, on a waste tip in London, they found a lot of immigration papers from when Capt Beefheart had tried to arrive in London. And the report said, the group arrived together and presented a very strange appearance, being attired in clothing ranging from jeans, in little inverted commas, to purple trousers and shirts of various hues, and wearing headgear varying from conical witches' hats to a brilliant yellow safety helmet of the type worn by construction workers. It says, when they eventually approached the desks, it proved somewhat difficult to interview them, as they appeared to think on a completely different mental plane and found it difficult to grasp the rudiments of passport control. And then when they asked, when they spoke to Capt Beefheart himself, they said, Beefheart replied that they were pilgrims from the 25th century and that the camera around his neck was a member of the band. And I like to start with that, because I feel like for the last 10 or 15 years, those of us doing transition have felt like pilgrims from the 25th century, and trying to bring ideas and bring a different vision of how the future could be into a world that has really not been ready for it. And we've operated as pioneers and putting out ideas. And the thing that has most intrigued me with the coronavirus crisis has been how all of a sudden so many of those ideas have kind of accelerated to being completely normal and to being very discussed in the mainstream in a way that's really fascinating. So I'm going to just share my screen, if I may, if this will work, because what I'd like to do is to share with you. How does that work? Can you see my screen now?
Yeah, that's good.
Is that a thing? Okay, cool. Yep. So I want to share with you 10 innovations that have come through the transition movement that we need now more than ever. And that strike, I think that's why there's Capt Beefheart, if nobody knows what they look like. So the first thing is this idea that we need to think intentionally and intelligently about food and how we feed our settlements. And this was a diagram that was produced in about 2009 by a wonderful project in London called Growing Communities, whose aim is to think, how could London feed itself? To what extent could London feed itself? And they run a vegetable box scheme and a community supported agriculture scheme and things like that. And based on that work for 20 years, they created this plan to say 2.5% of London's food could come from its back gardens, 5% from new intensive urban market gardens, 17.5% from the land right on the edge. You know, they've thought very, very consciously about this and what this would look like. In the transition movement, we've done that in a few different places. In about 2011, 2012, in Totnes, we did a big study called Can Totnes Feed Itself? Norwich did a Can Norwich Feed Itself study, which led to lots of change and lots of new projects in the city of Norwich. So that first thing, the idea that we need to plan strategically and intelligently around food system is really important. And when I look back now at this Can Feed Itself study, and I think, God, if we had done that, if we had had the support of the different local organizations to enable that to become a reality, we would be entering this COVID-19 crisis with such a stronger sense of resilience and a reduced sense of vulnerability, and a sense that we are able to manage and find a way through this as a crisis. The second one is this idea that we need anchor institutions, what we call anchor institutions. So in any town or city, the hospital, the schools, the university, the local government, the organizations that can't go anywhere else because they belong in that place, the potential of those organizations to use the money that they spend to bring about a new kind of economy is something that is really, really vital to transition being able to go to scale. And last year I went to a place called Montsartou in France, near Nice, where the municipality have created this market garden here on the edge of a town. They bought this land. It was going to be developed for housing. They bought the land. They created a market garden with 3 massive polytunnels. And in the market garden, they grow 70% of all the food for all the schools in the town. And 100% of what is served in those schools is organic. So, you know, when I look at that, for me, it was really emotional going to the place, because there are so many things that I have, I've spent years with this kind of vision in my head of how the future could be. And I'm going around sharing this with people, but to actually go to a place where I'm in it and I can see it and I can walk around in it is really very powerful. I'm just checking, is there any, there's nothing in there. Yes. So, so for me, that's really, really important, because this projects like this are a win-win-win-win-win response to climate change. They're good for mental health, physical health, public health, biodiversity, local economy, and so many other things. So this, you can also see this in the fantastic project in Liège, in Belgium, that was started by Transition Liège, called Ceinture Alimentaire, which means food belt, where they are intentionally reconnecting the city to the land around it. So this concept of a food belt is something that the transition group have pioneered there. In the last 5 years, they've created 21 new cooperatives. They've raised 5 million euros of investment from local people. They've started a farm, 2 vineyards, a brewery, this shop here in the center of town, which they now have 4 of these shops selling local produce. When I met the mayor of the city, he said, we used to say we wanted to be a smart city. Now we want to be a transition city. And in Liège, you can see this new food system emerging based on this idea of creating food belts. The next idea is the idea of community investment, bringing community investment in to support things, and the idea that things should be owned by the community, that the community should be the invitation to step up and actually own these things. So a project that I'm involved in my town is called the New Lion Brewery. If you ever come to the UK, you must come and visit our tap room once it's able to open again. We started about 5 or 6 years ago, and last year we became the first 100% community-owned brewery in the country. We invited local people to invest. We raised £180,000 to enable the business to expand, and we now have 270 owners who own the business. And so for me, we've seen this in many, many transition projects, this sense of saying, okay, the community is now invited to invest and to own this. And when I went to Liège, I met a guy who had started a cooperative vineyard, and they had raised 2.5 million euros to start a vineyard. I said, how did you do that? how did you think that people would want to support you in that? And he said, he looked at me kind of puzzled, and he said, it's Belgium. People like wine. People have some money. Don't be afraid. So I pass that advice on to any projects that you're involved in. I think the next one is around different models of democracy, and how do we bring transition thinking into democracy. So whether our groups, our organizations are more democratic, whether we're finding ways to work with our local municipality, but also we're seeing in many places, like in this town called Från, where many of the people who were involved in transition Från for the first 2 or 3 years, they then decided, actually, if we're really going to have an impact, we need to become the local government. And so a whole group of them from different political perspectives came together and agreed a shared platform, and they ran as independents for Från, and they took over the council. And now they are doing so many things that are really very progressive, and they are doing a kind of transition, but at a town scale, which is very, very fascinating for me to see. And this idea that if we want to change democracy, we need to get involved in it and to try and shape it. I think the next one is about what we call inner transition, and the idea that we need to be, particularly at this time of COVID-19, having the resources and the tools for people to be able to work with other people, to grieve and to manage the grief that is in this time, and the sense of possibility in it as well. And I see in many of the things that are happening in Totnes that actually a lot of the techniques that people learned through inner transition are now becoming really, really useful at this time where we are so kind of stretched and challenged and pulled in many different directions. I think the next one is around imagination. As you might imagine, you might know I just wrote a book about imagination. But for me, one of the things that was most important about that was it gave a kind of a mere way of looking at transition, that one of the things that transition does beautifully is it creates really powerful, what I call what if spaces, where people can come together with other people and say, yeah, what if, because there aren't so many other what if spaces in our life today. And one of the things that we did in Totnes a few years ago was called the Energy Descent Action Plan, which was a kind of a community dreaming exercise. It was the community coming together to say, what if the future turned out okay? And how would we have got there? What would we have done? What would the story have been that we were working towards? And that kind of creating and holding of what if spaces is really powerful. This is in London transition town Tooting, there is a place in the center of Tooting where, because Tooting is a neighborhood where they have no village green or town square or sort of shared people's space. There's one place that it could be, which at the moment is this place, which is a big bus turning circle. Normally, this place is full of buses.
We don't see any pictures now.
Oh, the pic. Oh. Back again. Good. Okay, can you see that? Good, thank you. So this is in London, this is in Tooting, and so Transition Tooting took over this space that was normally full of buses, and they said, what if this was our village green, if this was our town square? And they, for a day, they sent the buses away, and they filled that space with music and food and flowers and conversation and coffee. And I spent the whole day there. And as the day went on, I noticed the conversation change from, if this was our village green, to when this is our village green, da, 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 da. So they created that what if space. They held that space all day. And what it did was it changed the story that people told about that space and what they believed was possible. I think another thing that has come through through the transition movement that is proving really useful in terms of these times now is transition streets, which was something that we did here in Totnes. This idea that you get groups together on streets, 8 to 10 neighbors. You look at energy, water, food, and so on, and then you make changes. And we ran this here in Totnes. 550 households took part, and of those households, the vast majority of them put up solar panels, and on average, they cut their carbon footprint by 1.3 tons. But what's really interesting now is that in my town, many of those networks that are now the kind of COVID-19 mutual support networks are emerging on top of those networks that were created through transition streets. Many of those streets now feel so much more connected and able to work together because we laid some of that kind of resilience groundwork in the previous years. And many of those groups, after the 7 meetings were finished, they carried on meeting and creating all kinds of other projects. And I have no doubt the same will happen once people get used to working together in these times, that we'll see the same thing happening. I think another thing that we've really pioneered in the transition movement, which is really now coming into its own, as we are doing here today, is the use of online meetings and having a very conscious attempt to create a movement where we try to keep flying to the absolute minimum. So we started a movement that is now active in 50 countries around the world without people flying all around the world to make that happen. And I've been part of many different meetings over the last few weeks with different organizations and groups where it's clear that actually the skills to facilitate really good online meetings and online conferences, and now online festivals people are planning, and all sorts of stuff's moving online. And actually the skills that have been cultivated within the transition movement for how we do that are really, really precious and really important now. How do you do Zoom meetings where everybody doesn't talk over each other all the time, and so on. So turning the fact that we don't fly into a kind of into a positive, into something that is a fundamental platform of what we do that allows more innovation and new thinking is really powerful, I think. This is a project that was started in my town about 5 years ago, where people went to the local organic farm on the edge of the town, who were a big business, but who have lots of food that's not quite good enough to sell, that they were putting out for compost. And they would go once a week and they would collect that food, and then they would take it and then distribute it to organizations and individuals who were in food poverty. And it's grown very, very quickly. It's a project called Food in Community, but it's a project, excuse me, my dog just opened the door. Yeah, where was that? Yeah, so it's a project which now has become a fundamental part of the kind of emergency response in Totnes. You know, this organization has been up and running, it's been distributing food, it knows who the people and organizations in need are. So these kind of things that we've started as community projects now are really coming into their own as being a vital part of the kind of emergency response. So that's my 10 things that I made a note of just when I started to think about this. I guess for me, the thing that is most live with me at the moment is the question about what happens at the end of all of this, and what comes next. And so many of the things that we were told for years and years were completely impossible and naive and a complete fantasy to imagine are all of a sudden becoming completely possible. You know, now in the UK, the government has said that we want to have nobody sleeping on the street within a week. You know, we have to end rough sleeping within a week. It's like, well, that we were always told that was impossible. The idea that we could ground flights and massively reduce car travel and so on and so on, all of those things felt completely impossible. And although there are, of course, many appalling aspects of this crisis, I would really hope that one of the things that transition movement will be able to do at the end of this is to point to the good changes that have happened, and the improvements in air quality and the improvements in community cohesion and connection, and that we can then be part of a really informed conversation about what we keep because the idea that we keep hearing from governments about we need to get back to normal. When do we get back to normal? This is no longer about getting back to normal, because normal was a suicide pact. The normal was a complete disaster and a car crash from a climate perspective. So the question needs to be about, what we've, since the beginning of the transition movement, talked about resilience. The idea of resilience, about how do you bounce back from a crisis. But we've always said it's not about bouncing back. It's not about bouncing back to where you were before. It's about using that shock as the opportunity to bounce forward to something better, something which actually meets everybody's needs in a much more, in a way that's much more responsive to the situation that we're in. So hopefully I haven't talked for too long, and we have a little some chat and some conversation. Thank you very much.
Brilliant, Rob. Thank you very much. We started a little bit late. I haven't seen any questions. Oh, there we got one question. Can we expect cities with their current population to become self-sufficient in food? I think we could probably take that as yes or no.
I think it's well, that thing I showed at the very beginning with the thing in London. So what they said basically was London could produce, I think, about 60% maybe connected to the land around it, and that there would still need to be about 20% from international trade. And it's not self-sufficiency, no. But for me it's a bit about resilience, and every step we take towards that makes a place and has benefits at every step of the way. But I think self-sufficiency isn't really going to be that feasible.
No, I think, I mean, what I take mostly from what you've said was the way you summed it up at the end, and the way people always talk about development. We have to go back to, the development is always forwards, but now people are saying we have to go back to how it was. We have to go back to business as usual. But development now is, as you say, we bounce from this and continue going forwards, and we now recreate the new forwards together, depending on the visions that we have and we hold and we share with each other through things like this.
And I would say, from having spent the last couple of years researching the book that I just wrote about imagination, that actually one of the most important things is that we is that in everything that we do, whether we are, I saw some people on the thread who are here from Extinction Rebellion, for which I have the deepest admiration and respect, and my wife has already been arrested 4 times as part of Extinction Rebellion. I think police station now, they just say your usual room, and they but actually it feels like in all of those conversations, whether we are transition, whether we are Extinction Rebellion, all of the conversations that we have about the crisis that we're in and the nature of that crisis need to include some storytelling about what comes next, and trying to bring that to life. And XR have done that beautifully in London when they planted trees all down the centre of Waterloo Bridge and that kind of thing. But we need to be getting into all those conversations. We absolutely need to tell the truth part about the climate emergency, but we also need to be telling the stories about what we could create if we did everything now that we could possibly do.